I am super stoked. There's only so many people in this world that I track religiously and finding all the cool things that they do. And one of them is Kyle. He's a coastal oceanographer that I've known for quite a bit through some very circuitous pathways that we've come in and out of each other's lives. He got his bachelor's in geosciences of all thing with history from Trinity University in 2003, and then spent some time in the industry really honing his remote sensing and GIS skills before he started a PhD at UC Santa Barbara, where he did marine science and geography, right? Marine science, a degree we have here at Moss Landing, and geography, for those of you who don't understand, is at UC Santa Barbara, there is not an oceanography department. So geography is where it's housed. And if you look at Kyle's PhD from 2006 to 2011, when he finished, you look at his title page, two of the names you're going to see are Leib Washburn and Dave Siegel. And those guys wrote my letters of recommendation to Moss Landing Marine Labs in 1987 when Kyle was 7 years old. So it's just great to be able to follow him. Kyle comes, I don't want to say out of left field, but he comes in with tools that haven't really been appreciated and utilized in kelp forest systems. And I think that's what makes his work so darn exciting. He's now an associate professor in geography at UCLA, where he's been since 2014. And you're going to hear about kelps today. And that's what we've always talked about. We've worked on a couple of things in the past and talked about, just large scale patterns in these systems. But he's worked on terrestrial forests, marshes, marine reserves, wetlands, mangroves. And it's just cool when you've got somebody who's applying these tools to as many questions as possible. And all those questions I wanted to ask when I was, at his stage in his career, and he's just primed to take it on, and it's been really fun. So today we're actually going to hear a really topical conversation about kelp forests in California that's extremely relevant to us here. And the title of Kyle's talk is The Status of Kelp Forests in California, 7 years after the marine heat wave of 2014, 2016. Kyle, I could not be more excited.
Cool, thank you. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. And I'll say that Mike he's been supportive of me ever since I was a second year grad student. A lot of your work has been inspirational for my PhD work and beyond. And I'm pretty sure you were a reviewer. You signed reviewer of the first paper that I ever published. So it's been great to have that kind of behind the scenes support, and then the collaborations we've had since then. So thanks for this introduction. I love Moss Landing. I wish I was there in person, but I'm always really happy to talk to the folks there. And like my title says, I'm here. I'm going to give kind of a status update on California kelp forests 7 years after this massive marine heat wave that affected the state from 2014 to 2016. But first, I want to make it clear that much of what I'm presenting today was led by collaborators, students, and postdocs, and I especially need to recognize these three. I'll reference them throughout the talk. Tom Bell is a scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He's leading projects using Landsat satellite imagery to document kelp trends along the west coast of North America and other parts of the world. Kate Cavanaugh, who is a PhD student in my lab at UCLA. Incredibly, we're not related. I say this every time I introduce her. It's just a coincidence that our last names are spelled exactly the same. She's doing some incredible work with high resolution mapping of kelp dynamics in Northern California, and I'll highlight a lot of her work today. And then Nora Rafdalmu is a postdoc working with me and Theo McKelly up at Stanford. He's examining the protection status of kelp forests in California and globally, and studying impacts of kelp forest loss across Baja. So, big thanks to these folks. So to get us started, in 2014 to 2016, the West Coast of North America experienced this really unprecedented heat wave, both in terms of intensity and duration. Here's a satellite-derived sea surface temperature map from September 19, 2015. This was really representative of this whole 2-year period. Sea surface temperature anomalies of over 3 degrees Celsius for much of California. So here we have a time series of satellite-derived sea surface temperature for 3 regions in Southern California, again showing the extreme nature of this heat wave. Monthly anomalies above 4 degrees Celsius for a number of months. And in many cases, or most areas, I'd say this warming was was a greater intensity and duration than some of our big previous El Niños, like the 82-83 El Niño event, the 1997-1998 event. And this was linked to big ecological changes, things like reduced nutrients, reduced phytoplankton productivity, the appearance of unusual species of zooplankton in fish. There was, I remember, a tropical sea snake washed up in Oxnard, increased mortality of marine birds and mammals. And there was, as this was developing, there was a lot of concern among ecologists and coastal managers about what this meant for kelp forests. And previous ENSO events with warm sea surface temperature anomalies have been associated with declines in kelp. So there's an expectation that we're going to see a lot of loss of kelp, at least temporarily. This paper is a figure from Matt Edwards, and he did this great work comparing the impact of previous ENSOs on kelp abundance across California. These plots show time series of kelp abundance at different sites. Those ENSO periods are shaded in gray. And you can see there's some regional variability, but some of the big ENSO events like 1983 and 84, or sorry, 82 and 83, 1997 and 98 had pretty big declines in kelp, especially pronounced in Southern California, again, Baja California as well. But in most locations, kelp recovered relatively quickly from these disturbances. And this is another example where loss of kelp associated with a marine heat wave. This comes from subsurface Aclonia radiata forests off the coast of Western Australia. Here, warm sea surface temperature anomalies in 2011 led to essentially a complete loss of the kelp forest, replacement by seaweed turf. The notable thing about this change is that it was permanent, I guess, in terms of recent, at least the 5, 6, 7 years following the heat wave. Kelp forests did not return when the cool waters returned to this region. So it's now been almost exactly 7 years since the end of that big 2014-2016 heat wave. And so we can kind of take stock of that, the impacts of this disturbance on kelp, and see which areas were most impacted, and importantly, see if this heat wave led to any more persistent shifts in kelp habitat like we saw in Western Australia. So this is the question that I'm going to focus my talk around. We've used a few different satellite and aerial data sets to examine this question across spatial scales. And we'll start with kind of a large, broad scale analysis of both immediate and long-term impacts of the heat wave. Then I'll talk about how we're using high resolution imagery to zoom in and understand local kelp dynamics in an area that still has yet to recover from the heat wave. The large scale analysis is based on 30-meter resolution Landsat satellite imagery. I've presented this data set a number of times, including in talks in Moss Landing. I'm going to skip over the methods. I'm happy to talk more after for folks that are interested. But I'll note that these methods have been around for decades. We've applied them to Landsat imagery. What we've created is seasonal maps of kelp canopy from 1984 to the present. This covers the coastline from Washington to Baja. It includes both giant and bull kelp, but we can't differentiate species from Landsat. So essentially, this is a kelp canopy data set. I do want to take a moment and describe a new tool that we've created to visualize and share the data. Previously, the format of the data was pretty unwieldy. It was really difficult for others to use. But Tom Bell and I worked with the Nature Conservancy to develop this, I think, really cool visualization and data access tool called Kelp Watch. And it's already gotten a lot of use from scientists, managers, and the general public. I have this short video that just shows you how the tool works. Here's the landing page. You can see that methodology tab in the upper right. So for those interested in more details about the methodology, check that out. And then when you go to explore the map, you can zoom into whatever your favorite kelp forest along the west coast of North America is. And then there's this little animation where you can visually see how kelp canopy is changing through time. Those gray areas are what we're calling potential kelp habitat. So this is everywhere we've observed kelp at some point during the time series. And the blues and greens are where the kelp canopy was at this particular time. So here, Q4 of 2005. And then you can quantify the changes. So you can create an area of interest like this, and then a time series will pop up of total kelp canopy areas summed across your area of interest, and you can visualize the seasonal and the annual changes. You can download this data and the associated metadata. So I think it's very user friendly. Please check this out if you get inspired by any part of this talk, or you just think that kelp canopy time series data might be relevant to your own research. So we've used the data, like I said, to examine immediate, longer term impacts of that heat wave on kelp canopy from Oregon to Baja. We've developed a couple metrics to characterize this response of kelp. And first, we identified the heat wave period, so 2014 to 2016 is this period of extreme temperature anomalies, and compared the average kelp abundance in these heat wave years to a baseline. We're using the 10-year period from before the heat wave as the baseline. We're also identifying what we call a recovery period. This is the 6 years after the end of the heat wave. So in this case, 2017 to 2020. 22. And then by comparing kelp abundance during the recovery period to the period of the baseline, we can assess whether kelp has returned to pre-heat wave levels. I think it's pretty informative to compare this 14 to 16 heat wave with the last major heat wave, the 97, 98 ENSO event. So we calculated those same metrics for that event as well, as I'm showing here. And so these figures summarize the initial impacts of the two heat wave. These data is binned into 10-kilometer grid cells. So the figure on the left shows kelp abundance in 1998. So, right during that 97, 98 El Nino as a percent of the historical and the pre-ENSO baseline. So the period from 1986 to 1997. Figure on the right is kelp abundance in 2016. So right at the end of that other heat wave compared to its corresponding baseline. So 2004 to 2013. So these yellow areas are areas well below the baseline. In some cases, kelp was completely absent from a grid cell. The blue areas are areas where kelp abundance was close to the baseline. And one thing that really stands out to me is that these initial declines in kelp abundance were really more widespread during the 97, 98 El Nino. Basically, you see yellow everywhere. Most of the regions experienced major losses. In the 2014-2016 heat wave, at least at first, there was more variability. So, parts of southern Baja, Southern California, especially around San Diego and Orange counties, Northern California, all experienced, big declines. But other regions, parts of Northern Baja, Central California, really didn't see as much loss, at least initially. I think one explanation for this is that 97, 98 El Nino had major wave disturbance along with the warm temperatures. This figure shows monthly maximum significant wave height anomalies in Southern California, and similar patterns up through Central and Northern California as well. And this combination of wave disturbance, ripping out the kelp, and then warm sea surface temperatures, limited nutrients, reducing recovery, probably led to those initial kind of widespread impacts. There was the 2014-2016 heat wave had more severe temperature effects, but wave disturbance was low. But then, in the years following the two heat waves, there was a lot more variability in recovery after the 2014-2016 heat wave. So this shows average kelp abundance in the 6 years following each heat wave compared to the corresponding pre-heat wave baseline. And a few years after that 97, 98 El Nino, the region had mostly recovered to pre-heat wave levels. Whereas in today, there are still areas where kelp abundance is well below average, now 7 years after that 2014-2015 heat wave. So the very southern range limit of kelp is yet to recover. Again, parts of Southern California around San Diego, and then Northern California. And I think there's just so many interesting questions from this right-hand panel where my collaborators are exploring just some of them. For example, Tom Bell is leading some work into some interesting but concerning trends around Monterey. The time series on the left shows that decline during the heat wave that's highlighted in red, but then a continued decline. Actually, kelp not only didn't recover it continued to decline in the years following the heat wave. These declines have been linked to urchin overgrazing. But even within the peninsula, there's a lot of variability. Much of the peninsula is well below average, but there's these little coves, these little pockets that actually, have normal kelp abundance. And then if you look just a little bit north to Santa Cruz, kelp abundance is at normal levels. Just a little bit south in Big Sur, kelp is doing pretty well. So a lot of interesting patterns there. And then NOR is leading some work looking at patterns of recovery in Baja. This is an area where we might expect kelp forests to be especially sensitive to warming, because this represents the southern range limit of giant kelp. And NOR is combining this satellite data with some intensive field sampling. Last summer he conducted subtidal diver surveys at over 30 sites across Baja. This data is shown in the stacked panels to the left there. He found that the southernmost giant kelp forests disappeared after the heat wave and again have yet to recover. So the range limit for giant kelp has actually shifted northward by 50 or 100 kilometers. And you can see that here in the subtitle surveys, basically zero kelp at these southernmost sites. Those kelp forests have been replaced by Asenia arborea, so this subsurface palm kelp. So there's some competition going on here. But just a little bit further north, close to the range limit, kelp came roaring back. This area around Bahia Tortugas, it's very high giant kelp coverage. And then further north in northern Baja, like around Ensenada, again, these low areas that are kind of similar to Monterey in that they have continued to decline following the heat wave. Here, we're seeing more and more urchin barrens in Northern California, potentially associated with a lack of urchin predators like lobster and sheephead. So lots of interesting stuff going on. NURS is writing up these results. Keep an eye out for that. But I think the area where kelp declines have been the most severe, the most long-lasting since 2014 is Northern California. And I'm going to spend the rest of the talk focused on this region. These losses have been documented by other studies. For example, there's this great study by Laura Rogers-Bennett and Cynthia Cadden that used high-resolution aerial surveys from the state of California to show a loss of over 90% of bull kelp canopy between 2014 and 2016. And those losses occurred over hundreds of kilometers of coastline. They were caused by a combination of factors. So there's the heat wave, the low nutrient conditions, but around the same time, sea star wasting disease wiped out sea stars from across the West Coast. And sea stars are probably the most important predator of sea urchin in this region. So that released sea urchins from predation, and then extreme overgrazing by the urchins, also hammered kelp forests. So the result was really devastating, both ecologically and economically. A huge number of fish, invertebrates, marine mammals, and seabirds depend on kelp for food and habitat. Some of these species support important fisheries. Kelp forests are a popular destination for recreational diving. This is a relatively rural region that's highly dependent on fishing and tourism. So big losses. And essentially all across Northern California, these beautiful, diverse, productive bull kelp forests transformed into large, barren expanses of seafloor. So, this was devastating. There have been some interesting patterns that you might interpret as signs of hope. For one, not all the kelp was lost. So, even these maps from the Rogers-Bennett and Catton paper show little patches of kelp that managed to persist. And then also we observed a significant increase in kelp abundance between 2020 and 2021. There's some drone surveys that we collected both those years up in Mendocino County. So these two observations lead to the questions that I'm going to explore during the rest of the talk. So for one, why were these little patches of kelp able to hang on to persist? What factors promoted the resilience of kelp in these locations? And then what explains some of these patterns of recovery that we observed between really 2019 and 2021? So again, these aerial surveys from the Rogers-Bennett and Catton paper they were conducted by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, so CDFW. They conducted aerial surveys from the late 90s to 2016, more or less annually, but data coverage was a little bit limited due to cloud cover and other data acquisition issues, especially in Northern California. And it was just difficult and costly to collect this imagery. So the state program was ended in 2016, which was right in the middle of this critical period where kelp disappeared across this region, across a big portion of the state. So we need to use some other data to investigate the patches, the persistence, the trends since 2016. Now, Landsat does capture this regional decline and provides a really long time series, as I mentioned earlier, but the 30-meter resolution of Landsat is really not ideal for mapping these small sparse patches of kelp. And this is especially for bull kelp canopy, which tends to be a little bit less dense than giant kelp. There was this 2021 paper by Dennis Finger and others that compared Landsat to high resolution data along the coast of Northern California. They found a strong correlation between Landsat and these aerial surveys, the high resolution aerial surveys, but found that Landsat underestimated kelp in some situations. And more importantly, for our purposes, Landsat missed some of the small sparse canopies altogether. You can see that in this figure from the paper. The green pixels are the 30-meter Landsat, the gray areas are the high resolution. And so these big patches, Landsat does well. But then when you start to get these small sparse areas, Landsat's not picking them up. And these small sparse persistent patches is exactly what we're trying to map. We want to know why this little bit of kelp over here was able to persist. So Landsat's really not the ideal tool for this. So to address this, we use planet imagery to build a high resolution time series of kelp canopy for this region. This was again led by Kate Cavanaugh, the grad student in my lab, forms a good portion of her dissertation. And PlanetScope or Planet in general is a pretty interesting company. This is a private company that operates a constellation of satellites. So, most of the work I've done previously have been these big government-run programs. Planet is, rather than developing, testing, and operating these large, expensive satellites, they are working with a constellation of small, relatively inexpensive satellites with smaller footprints, shorter lifespans. But with hundreds of satellites in orbits now, they can provide essentially daily coverage of the globe at 3-meter resolution. That's 10 times the spatial resolution of Landsat. The bands are similar to Landsat, and so we can use really similar methods that we have done with Landsat for many years now. We can apply that to this high resolution imagery. And I think I mentioned earlier that mapping kelp canopy on the surface of the ocean has been done for decades. It's from satellite imagery, from airborne imagery. It's relatively straightforward remote sensing problem. The challenge is in automating the process while maintaining the really high levels of accuracy that's needed to do a lot of the science questions, right? If you're interested in really small patches, you can't have a lot of false positive or false negatives. This is particularly a problem with Planet because the data is quite a bit noisier than Landsat. That's one of the drawbacks of these small and expensive satellites. But Kate's developed some processing methods that address these issues. This slide depicts the first approach that she developed. This was a basic version of machine learning. She essentially identified examples of kelp canopy and water across a wide range of images, so collected a lot of training data, and then taught a naive Bayes classifier to detect kelp. This is like a pixel-based machine learning classifier. So it produces scene-based probabilities of kelp that you can see in this stacked image. And in general, it does a good job, but there's some noise in each image, and some images like this have a ton of speckle, a ton of noise. Essentially here, the yellow areas are the higher probability locations. But when we combine multiple images, we get a much cleaner output. So you can combine 5 or 10 or 15 images per month and get a very accurate monthly map of kelp canopy without a lot of manual editing. And so this harnesses that benefit of the high repeat that Planet satellites provide. She is moving towards more complex machine learning neural network approach, which is hot right now, but having some really promising results from those efforts. We validated those planet-based classifications of bulk kelp canopy with a series of very high-resolution drone surveys conducted across Sonoma and Mendocino counties in 2019, 2020, 2021. This was in conjunction with, or really led by, the Nature Conservancy. Some of the details of this efforts are in this paper, Sakamano et al. 2022. And found good matchups. So the planet-based classifications matched up well with the drone data. And this figure shows that comparison between planet and UAV for those sites. Each one of these points is one of the sites one of the sites that we surveyed kelp summed from our UAV surveys compared to that same area as mapped by planet. And even though the drone imagery had much higher resolution, there wasn't much systematic bias. So we're confident with these planet-based maps of bulk kelp. So with this data now, we can extend the time series started by CDFW. So if we've restricted the CDFW aerial data set just to years where we had complete coverage of this region of Sonoma and Mendocino counties. And so that gives us annual maps in 1989, 1999, 2003 through 2005, 2008, and then 2014 to 2016. We resampled those to 3-meter resolution to match the planet data. And then we're using planet to extend that. And with planet, we have annual maps created from 2016 to 2022. Both those images were the annual maps from both data sets were created from imagery collected between September and October, which is generally peak bulk kelp abundance in this region. So this is the data that provides the foundation for these studies that are examining resilience of kelp and patterns of recovery. So let's start with the first question. Where was kelp able to persist along the North Coast, and what factors were linked to this resilience? So to do this, we created maps of persistence and refugia from that annual canopy data. And by annual canopy data, I'm talking about the planet data set and CDFW. Here we focused on the period after the heat wave, so 2016, 2020. So our persistence metric is just the number of times that a 3-meter pixel was occupied, during these 5 years. So if a pixel was occupied all 5 years, it got a persistence score of 5. If it was never occupied, it persistence score of 0. And then we defined kelp refugia as areas that were occupied in the majority of those years. So occupied in 3 or more of the years. And the results I'm going to show are, they hold whether we change that refugia definition to be occupied in 2 years or 4 years. So we have done some sensitivity analysis there. So this next figure shows spatial distribution of refugia across Sonoma and Mendocino counties, bin to 1 kilometer grid cells. So here we compared the total area of refugia to the area of potential habitat. That's again an area that has been occupied by kelp at some point during our time series. And as you can see, very low values, between 1, maybe maxing out at 10% of potential habitat was occupied during this period. A lot of variability in space and no real clear latitudinal pattern. So to try to understand what factors were contributing to this variability, we used the native 3-meter resolution data and compared it to a variety of gridded environmental variables that were predictors for kelp refugia. So we looked at bathymetry, depth, slope, rugosity. We looked at things like distance to river mouths, because there's some evidence that fresh water can impact urchin grazing. Sea surface temperature, the position of a pixel within potential habitat. So are you in the center of a rocky reef complex or on the edge? Wave exposure. We performed logistic regressions comparing the presence and absence of refugia to each of these continuous predictors. And we found that refugia were significantly correlated to depth, distance to river mouths, and location within those historical patches. So in other words, those refugia tended to be in shallow areas. They tended to be close to river mouths and in the center of reefs, center of habitat patches. And we think that this may be related to urchin grazing. So, these shallow areas may experience more wave disturbance, more water movement that could potentially dislodge urchins. There's some evidence that freshwater urchins don't do as well in freshwater with lower salinities. And so maybe their grazing is affected. And so maybe the freshwater inputs for areas close to river mouths give kelp a respite from grazing. And then these habitat patches, maybe there's something about the center of these reefs where there's more likely to be some kind of barriers to movement, from the edge to the center of the reef. So that's our interpretation there. Now, our second question explores the patterns of recovery between 2020 and 2021. So here I'm showing a regional time series. So this is kelp canopy, bull kelp canopy summed across this whole Northern California region, showing the CDFW aerial surveys in gray and our planet data in green. Another piece of evidence that builds confidence in the planet data is actually we had complete coverage with both data sets in 2016, and they all overlap almost perfectly. And so you can see, a lot of variability before the heat wave, this dramatic collapse in 2014, 90% loss. That period of low kelp persisted, through 2020, historically low levels. But then we saw a pretty large increase between 2020 and 2021. In 2021, kelp was back in this range of historical variability that we've observed before. So what enabled this increase? So let's think a little bit about some of the conditions needed for recovery, for recruitment and recolonization of empty patches of habitat. For one, we need good physical environmental conditions, and we've been talking a lot about nutrient availability. So cool water temperatures associated with nutrients to allow recruitment and growth. We also need reductions in grazing. So urchins can survive in a state of starvation for many years, and when they're starving, they tend to move around looking for food, and so they can graze down any new recruits before they can really get going. So we need some change in urchin abundance or behavior that allows for kelp to develop. Then we also need kelp to recolonize that empty habitat. So kelp reproduces by releasing spores, which settle and then become haploid gametophytes. And if those gametophytes settle close to each other, the sperm and eggs that they release can develop into sporophytes, which then can mature into juvenile and adult kelp. So we need some source of the spores. This could be from a bank of spores that were able to persist, during the years of kelp loss, or they might come from existing kelp forests, which is why those areas of persistence, those areas of refugia that we were talking about early, may be really important for recolonizing empty habitat. And so, if that is the case, we want to know what's the distribution of refugia that's needed for regional recovery. Or in other words, how far can spores realistically travel from a remnant patch and recolonize habitat? And these dispersal kernels are complex, they're highly variable. Previous studies, like this paper by Brian Gaylord, have estimated, this is for giant kelp, for macrocystis, have estimated dispersal on the order of meters to maybe kilometers. It probably holds for bull kelp as well. So most of the dispersal probably happens within meters, but there's relatively long tails, or the potential for long tails. One thing to note is that the gametophytes have to settle very close to one another, and so density of settlement matters as well. So these are the factors that are needed for kelp recruitment. I want to start by just looking at the first two. So, can we explain any of that recovery in 2021 from environmental conditions or grazing pressure? And we've gathered some predictor variables to try to test this. So annual mean sea surface temperature data for the study region was collected from the 5-kilometer resolution NOAA Coral Reef Watch data set. And again, we're using sea surface temperatures as a proxy for nutrients. So cooler sea surface temperatures, like in 2021, tend to be associated with higher levels of nutrients, better conditions for kelp growth. Warm sea surface temperatures, like 2014, 2015, assumed to limit kelp growth. And then we have, this is somewhat preliminary, but we're collecting scuba surveys of urchin abundance from a few different data sets listed here. These range from 6 to 23 sites per year. And for this analysis, I averaged across all sites, just get a regional mean urchin density for this time series. And the urchin data is shown on the left here. We have data starting in 2006 through 2022. You can see this large increase in urchins starting around 2014. Interestingly, urchin abundance remained relatively high in 2021 during that period of recovery. So it doesn't seem like the regional increase was explained by a sudden decline of urchins, at least at these sites that were sampled. Instead, sea surface temperature did a better job of explaining variability in regional kelp abundance. The top figure shows monthly sea surface temperature in blue, and then the annual mean in red. 2014, 2015 were the warmest years on record, as we've mentioned. The marine heat waves got a lot of attention, but conditions didn't really return to normal following those years. 2016 through 2019 were still well above average, especially in the spring and early summer, which we think is where a lot of recruitment occurs. We finally did see more cooler, nutrient-rich conditions in 2021, which coincided with that increase in kelp. And when we plot regional sea surface temperature against regional kelp canopy area, so kelp canopy area is summed across the region, we do see a relationship here. Sea surface temperature explains a reasonable amount of variance in regional kelp abundance. So that's part of the story. So I guess I'll say that period of really low kelp abundance from 14 to 19 also was a period of warm, extended period of pretty poor environmental conditions for kelp. When we saw conditions improve in 21, we saw kelp recover. You still can see that like the points for 2019, 20, 21 are below this regression line. So there's definitely other factors like grazing, maybe dispersal limitation that could be responsible for some of this unexplained variation. So that's regional. If we look, there's a lot of spatial variability in recovery too. So again, here we've binned the data into 1 kilometer grid cells just so you can see it zoomed out at this regional level. We calculated the average pre-heat wave kelp area from the CDFW again, and then use that as a baseline, compared the amount of kelp in 2021 to that baseline. So these yellow areas are back to normal, I'd say. The blue areas are well below average, and the gray areas have not shown any recovery yet. So again, a lot of spatial variability, not a clear latitudinal gradient. And importantly, these patterns are not explained by sea surface temperature. So spatial variability in sea surface temperature is not explained spatial variability in kelp abundance. And that's true whether we look at absolute sea surface temperatures, anomalies. So I think this indicates that the conditions in 2021 crossed some threshold. They were more or less suitable regionally, but variability within the region didn't really explain why kelp recovered here but not here. Urchins are almost certainly a big factor of this spatial variability on local scales, but we don't really have sufficient data to examine this. We're working on this, but we only have a handful of sites from 2021, and again, urchin abundance can be so variable in space. It's hard to this limits our ability to attribute those spatial patterns to urchins. But again, another factor may be spore supply. So maybe when those environmental conditions improved, sites that had some supply of spores were more likely to recover. So sites near those remnant patches of kelp, those kelp refugia, probably have a higher spore supply, and so we wanted to test whether they were more likely to recovery. And anecdotally, we did notice that increases in kelp canopy in 20 and in 21 tended to occur around patches of previously occupied habitat. So this is a site, again, in Mendocino County. There was some persistent kelp that found in this site. And then when we saw this big increase in 2021, it was around these small persistent patches. And here's a series of maps showing a similar pattern over a larger region. This is in Sonoma County, just a bit north of Jenner. The green is kelp canopy in any given year. It's really hard to see some of these green areas because they're so small, especially in 2019 and 2020. So I've used arrows to point them out, but they are there. There's these small patches of refugia here in 2019, and then you see expansion in 2020, and then even more so in 2021. So it does seem that kelp is kind of expanding around these persistent patches. We're not just limited to anecdotal observations. So the spatial resolution and coverage of our satellite-based observations can let us quantify this relationship between recolonization probability and distance to occupied habitat. So we're developing connectivity metrics using these kelp canopy maps. And here I'm using connectivity as a measure of spore supply. The analysis I'm presenting today uses the simplest version of connectivity that you can imagine. So just minimum distance to occupied habitat. So this figure shows the minimum distance as calculated from 2020 canopy cover. So the red areas, or sorry, the green areas are occupied habitat. The color bar shows the distance from occupied habitat. So these blue areas are close to this occupied habitat, close to these green patches. These yellow and greens are, further away, in this case, 9-10 kilometers, 9-10,000 meters. I recognize this is super simple. There's certainly limitations. This doesn't take into account the density of surrounding kelp, doesn't count for asynchronous dispersal due to things like ocean currents. And we're definitely working on developing more, developing other connectivity metrics that account for some of these things. But as a starting point, this is easy to interpret in terms of scales of effective spore dispersal. And so again, it's a starting point. So here we've compared recolonization probability to the previous year's isolation, the previous year's distance from occupied habitat. So the figure to the left uses the distance from occupied habitat in 2019 to compare that to whether a pixel recovered in 2020. Figure on the right uses the amount of kelp in 2020 to predict whether a pixel recovered in 2021. Then for each of these plots, the upper histogram shows the distribution of distance to occupied habitat for pixels that did recover. The bottom histogram shows the distance to occupied habitat for pixels that didn't recover. Then the line shows the logistic regression relating colonization to that distance, that isolation metric. In both cases, we saw that the places that were closer to occupied habitat were, higher probability of recolonization. You can see that the absolute magnitude of recolonization probability is higher in 2021. Again, the year that we saw the big increase. In both cases, probability of recolonization declined really rapidly with increasing distance to refugia, increasing distance to the habitat the previous year. And there was a very low probability of recolonization for areas that were greater than 500 meters, greater than a kilometer from occupied habitat. All right, so to summarize these points, there's a lot of spatial variability in kelp recovery 6 years after the heat wave. There's some places that are still well below average. And so it does seem that this big disturbance has had some long-lasting effects. This is particularly the case in Northern California, where that warm water coincided with this explosion of urchins. In Northern California, there seems to be an interaction between environmental factors, grazing pressure, and dispersal. So some of those environmental factors directly influence kelp. So things like sea surface temperature and nutrients. Others may mediate grazing, freshwater outflows, depth and wave disturbance. And then when conditions improve, spores from those persistent patches of kelp may recolonize empty habitat. So that's my relatively clean story. I should stop here, but I want to be honest about how much we still don't know. And so I'm going to end with an observation that really complicates that story. Based on this, I was expecting further recovery in 2022. Temperatures were relatively cool. Environmental conditions seemed suitable. We had a good amount of kelp in 2021, so ideally we should have had a lot of spore supply. But after that increase in 2021, we saw a decline again in 2022, back to these really low levels. And again, like I mentioned, temperatures in 2022 are relatively cool. So 2022 falls way below this, the regression line. It's way below our expectation. So something else is going on here, and we did some field work. We were involved in some diver surveys. This is a video of some imagery collected from a submersible for sites in Mendocino County, and we saw this over and over again, just urchins everywhere at these sites. So the question that remains is what's going on with urchins that allowed some recovery in 2021, but then why did these barrens return in many places in 2022? And we don't have good answers for that. I'm super eager to see what happens next year. If this freshwater input does indeed negatively impact urchin grazing, then we should see some interesting patterns with all the rain, all the freshwater inputs that we've had this past winter. So stay tuned. I can't wait to get my hands on the the data from the late summer and fall, the planet data from late summer and fall, and see what kelp does next year. So that's all I have. Thank you. Check out Kelp Watch if you think this data is useful. So we recently got funding from the state of California to expand this high resolution planet mapping across the entire state. So again, we're trying to use this planet data to continue those CDFW aerial surveys. I'm actively looking for a postdoc. So if you know anyone, with some remote sensing skills that is interested in working on kelp and would be happy to work at UCLA and move to LA, please spread the word. Email, I'm happy to provide more details. You can email me at kcavanaugh@geog.ucla.edu. But yeah, please spread the word to your networks. I'm desperately looking for a good postdoc. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions. With the time that we have.
Kyle, can you hear me?
Yep.
Right on. That was awesome. And your plug at the end for the remote sensing, I got to put another shameless one in. For the first time in 20 years, Moss Landing Marine Labs is going to have its first remote sensing class offered here in the fall with our newest faculty member, Mike Wood. So yes, for all of the biologists that are the oceanographers, it's an easy sell, but for all of the biologists that are watching, that are potentially looking at classes, this is exactly the type of questions you could be asking with some of those skills, or at least an understanding of those skills. I also got to say, Kyle, that you always make me feel old and young when I listen to you talk. I feel old because the tools are so far beyond where it was when I was trying to pose these questions of scale, and it's super cool to see them finally aligning. Young because, darn it,
same questions.
I've been saying over and over again that it's not just the urchins, and the fact, I don't care if it blipped or whatever, the bump in 2021 is more than anybody who's funding this work, reviewing this work, or anything else ever expected. All they said was remove the urchins, remove the urchins, remove the urchins. And what your work is showing synoptically across the whole area is that that's not the whole story, and that there are scenarios where biology takes precedence, and it's really cool. And that leads to my question, right? I'm not just on a soapbox to hype myself, but the point was, this is really cool retroactive. I would love to hear from you. I mean, you got to 2022, that was great, but I'd love to hear from you the inherent lags that make this less of a proactive approach. We know the Nature Conservancy, we know OPC, we know CDFW and the state are trying to take a proactive approach on where do they want to do restoration, where do they want to remove urchins. They would love to be able to have something similar to, just to use, an analogy, all of the rain forecasts we had and where flooding were going to be an issue. Those were almost real time. This isn't real time. What keeps it from being real time? Is it your ability to process the data? Is it Planet Watch's ability to get Planet Imagery's ability to get the data up? Where's the lag here that makes this less of a real-time tool?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's on our end, so it's in our ability to process the data, but that's changing. And I mentioned Kate's advances with neural network based approaches. We're already reducing the lag time quite a bit. And I know one of the things that OPC is really interested in is getting this out. Getting this out in more real time. And I think we're very close to being able to do that. It's just a matter of getting the production workflow up, but the methods have advanced to the point where I think we can turn this around much more quickly. And so get a sense in early summer of how things are looking, to predict where to do restoration, to predict if it's a good year to do restoration, or if you clear out urchins and it's a bad year environmentally for recruitment, then maybe that effort is lost, or the types of restoration that you might need to do. So that's kind of like the next step, and we're getting much better. I will say Planet makes Planet releases their image. I think the lag time with them is days to weeks, and so it's really on the processing side of things.
Okay, I think I'm back. There you go. I do have a question I want to read for you. And this is from a student. Her name's Madison McKay, and she actually just wrote in the chat, so I'm going to read it for you. She's a student of myself and Corey Garza, does a lot of drone work for her
Oh
master's.
yeah, know Corey well.
Yeah, so she, her comment is great talk. Thank you. Is there any benefit of using drones over the planet scope imagery if the resolution is comparable? And then a second part of this, and you kind of already got at this, I think, in your talk a bit, was how far back does the planet scope data really go for this actual application?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question. The planet scope goes back to 2016. And so, the nice thing about Landsat is it goes back to the 80s. Planet scope goes back to 2016. And but still you can get, if you develop a new method that utilizes Planet for kelp or some other remote sensing thing, the really nice thing is you can kind of go back and retrospectively look at how things changed. I think drones definitely have there's applications where you want to bring drones into use, because they just have so much higher resolution, right? When we do a drone survey, it's centimeter scale resolution, whereas Planet is 3 meters. So, one application I can think of is that Planet's still not fine enough to differentiate bull kelp from giant kelp. So if you're studying areas of mixed beds and you really need to know, really need to differentiate the species, drones probably the best option for that. If there is restoration, urchin clearing, something that's on a really small scale, and those 3 megapixels are not suitable. Like, let's say you're clearing an area that's 5 meters by 5 meters, or doing some, maybe not restoration, doing some field experiment where you're manipulating things on the scale of meters, 5 meters, 10 meters, then the drone imagery might let you detect the response in more detail than Planet. I'll say that the limitation for drone surveying is you just can't cover regional scales. Like, it takes a ton of work just to map a single cove, like collecting the imagery, processing the imagery. That effort that I mentioned that was led by TNC, we had like 5 or 6 different drone teams spending multiple days, doing flights, and that still didn't provide complete coverage. It provided, a sampling of sites across the region. And so I think you'll never get tens to hundreds of kilometers of coverage with drones, but for site level data collection, they can be really useful.
Well, and luckily, your analyses have identified that there are these potential refugia or these site-specific effects that could potentially help identify areas where intensive drone work might be useful.
Good point.
I got another question here, and this is going to be from Daniel Gossard. We're going to let him unmute and undo his video. So if Nalina can give Dan access, he'll come in and ask his question. Just give it a sec. There we go. Can you speak, Dan? Dan? All right, well.
There might be a couple of mic issues on Dan's end.
Yeah, we'll let him try to figure that one out. If not, he could potentially type in his question, or by all means, Dan, just text me and I'll read the question off to Kyle. Kyle, I'm going to ask another one while we're at it. I'm, I feel the pain, right? The idea of scale and the ability to get coverage, trying to use private dollars from TNC, trying to use state dollars, and now there's possibly even the chance to use federal dollars to do this. We've done this before. I was, I knew Wheeler North when he flew a Cessna out of LA by himself. I knew Brian Kinlan when he was analyzing massive amounts of privately collected data. We kind of get these bursts around catastrophic events that take down probably the world's most charismatic foundation species, right? When does it stick, right? Why hasn't it stuck as a systematic approach to monitoring these resources?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, they obviously saw the value in terms of conducting those aerial, like spending the resources and a good amount of money to do their statewide monitoring survey. And so, I think there's people that have seen the importance of this. I think they just kind of ran up against budget restrictions. It got too expensive, and saw the advances that were happening with satellite imagery. But I wonder if we would have gotten the funding to use Planet to continue that time series if there hadn't been this collapse in the North Coast. So you're right. I guess I don't have an answer to that. I think that we have to take advantage when there are this interest from the state, from the federal government, from local conservation groups. I don't know how to keep the spotlight on and emphasize the importance of monitoring in the good years too. But it's critical. And again, it's a nice thing about these satellites that are constantly collecting data. If the data is there, if you get funding 10 years from now, you can kind of go back and make this retrospective time series. I think it's like your point is even more valid for field surveys that require constant funding to maintain. So I didn't really answer your questions. I don't have an answer other than to say, like, let's take advantage when the interest's there, and hopefully this interest in the importance of kelp will continue.
Well, I'm going to give you my answer while I move to
please.
take a question from the audience, and we're also going to let Dan come on because his mic's working. But my answer is if you look at these other programs that have done this around the state and are still here, for example, the CDIP program that models wave exposure along the coast, why is that currently funded? It's funded because surfers need it. They need it as part of their life, right? Why do we have these things for various, when you get the public to the point where they need this resource because it's providing them perspective, whether it be aesthetic perspective, economic, if you get fisher people who need your real-time kelpwatch.org program, then it stays. So I think that's the key here is keep doing what you're doing and make it as real-time, user-friendly, and effective as possible. And let's see if we can get these groups to absolutely need it for their lives. So
you're right. Thank you. That's a really good point.
I'm gonna let Dan unmute and see if we can get his question, and then we're gonna take a question from the live audience.
Hi, Kyle. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, great talk. And Mike sort of took a little bit away from what I was going to say, but I mean, I got three questions. So first of all, in terms of in the future, do you see the applications of tools like these to be a lot more real time in a way that they could that you can potentially forecast what it's going to be for the next year as a way to inform managers or for fisheries, things like that? Like what's some ideal future applications for tools like these that you can envision?
Yeah. So and my collaborator Tom Bell is working on that project, just to kind of do an alert if kelp starts to decline. I think a lot of what they're using is as close to real-time data as possible, but maybe moving into some predictive capacity. And I like we're getting better at modeling kelp abundance as a function of waves and sea surface temperature, nutrients, urchin data where we have it. And so then I think the forecasting becomes a matter of our ability to forecast those variables. So if we, I haven't done this work yet, but if we can, take 3-month forecasts of sea surface temperature, take some of these ENSO forecasts, then the problem with ENSO, I think, is that the strong ENSOs have a signal, but a lot of the weak and moderate ENSOs don't really. But if we can get better forecasts of sea surface temperatures, nutrients upwelling, I think that's the trick. So I think there's some potential there, and this is where I have to lean on the physical oceanographers and climatologists.
Yeah, especially with the uncertainty of what's going to be happening in the next few decades.
Yeah.
So next question is, you did a great job with pointing out the refugia associated with river mounts, freshwater inputs. Is there any sort of deleterious effect associated with sedimentation that you could pick up that is also attributed to those places?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So I think, yeah, that river input could be a double-edged sword. Like maybe it inhibits urchin grazing, but it could lead to sedimentation of the reefs, and I've seen that at sites where I did my PhD work in Santa Barbara that got, they were kelp forests, and then they got covered with sediment, and the kelp didn't return for many years. There's also light limitation, so the light limitation during this important period of recruitment could limit recruitment too. So I haven't analyzed that yet. I'm interested in doing so, but I haven't looked for an effect of kind of darkening or sedimentation on kelp. But I think this data set that's one of the really cool things to explore with this data set. And another great question about next year, like maybe all the freshwater input was just there's just too much sediment, too much darkening, and so maybe that actually inhibits kelp. We'll have to see, but that's a really good idea for another analysis with this data, especially the high resolution stuff.
Yeah, it makes me think like, are these storms really going to be beneficial in that way? Because at least from Moss Landing's perspective, it was a huge plume of zero visibility water, just almost as far out as the eye could see. Last question, and I really liked, probably the best thing about the talk, in my opinion, was the nearest neighbor in regards to persistence and recovery. And that is just like the coolest thing. What are your next steps for parsing out that in terms of the variables that you're going to be exploring further?
Yeah, so the immediate next step, I need to make a metric that takes into account not just the nearest neighbor distance, but the weights, how, like, all the kelp around you, right? So kind of like a weighted sum of like, are you close to just like this tiny little patch of kelp, or are you close to a huge forest that could produce, so like the I guess spore production piece of things. And so I think there's some straightforward people like in the metapopulation world, people have making incidence functions. So there's some straightforward metrics that we can do to incorporate the amount of kelp that's surrounding an area of interest, not just the closest one, and then bringing in current data. So are the prevalent currents, how do they play a role in moving spores around? So I think those are the two kind of immediate next steps for refining that analysis.
Love it. Thank you.
Right on. Yeah, it makes me think of gravity, man. The mass of the forest is more related to the attraction.
Yeah.
Nalina, can you unmute or unvideo? And if we still have a question from the audience, is that?
Yeah.
There we go.
Do you have a question from the audience? Should I just sneak on it? Yeah. Hi there. My name is Katie. I had a couple of questions. You answered some of them with your answer to Dan's question. My first one was, with the winter storms, there's also the associated like increased turbulence, and then the nutrient load that, coupled with the sedimentation in freshwater, seems kind of like, can you comment on that? Like, where do you see that potentially go?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, there's so many factors related to these freshwater inputs, and so I think it's going to be a challenge to try to tease some of them apart. And so this is, because like you said, the maybe nutrient inputs, it's an additional source of nutrients that could benefit kelp growth. There's the freshwater impacts on urchins, like we talked about, potential for sedimentation and shading. And so I this is something where we can do some things with the satellite data. Maybe we can find gradients of water clarity using satellite light, like satellite light and the attenuation coefficient data. So maybe we can find gradients of light attenuation, see if that relates to probability of kelp recovery. But I think really to tease out some of these competing factors, like field studies would be necessary. And so yeah, like there's some collaborators that have done some controlled tank experiments showing that grazing rates of urchins go down with fresh water. So at least like we have an idea of that mechanism. And so field and lab studies to tease about the mechanism of the effect, and then again field studies to try to identify at a site what the roles of the various factors are, I think are going to be important.
I did have one more question. I don't think that this was addressed at all, but does the genetic diversity of the parent stock after a die-off have any effect on the rate of recovery? I imagine after repeated die-offs, there's less and less diversity.
Great question. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't work on that. I have some colleagues that are trying to look at whether we're losing diversity from these die-offs. Mike might know more than I do. I know that like if inbreeding can reduce kelp fitness, and so some work from Pete Raimonde and Philippe Alberto has shown reduction in the fitness from inbreeding, but like kind of in controlled settings. I know Philippe is doing some work looking at the impacts of these die-offs on genetic diversity. I don't know the results of that yet. It's a good question.
I will jump in though, Katie, to throw right on top of what Kyle said. Absolutely. So Philippe has been doing that. We've been asking those questions for the restoration because we want to know, hey, can we restore an area north of Albion using Albion stock, because Albion's the only stock that survived, right? Do we want to be? And the first argument has been that the initial genetic surveys is everything's effectively ecologically homogeneous. However, when you start to look at those foci that Kyle's showing that get created, I think that's the interesting part. But for the short answer for the question is that the kelps are fully interfertile. We don't see any current barriers to this because bull kelp is an annual and it gets restricted. It's like cheetahs. They're used to working at really low population sizes. So I don't think they see as much of the fitness effects that we see for a lot of these other organisms. But you can't ask those questions without this data set, which is what makes it super cool. So I think, Katie, that might be one of the more fun questions that comes out in the next few years, is whether people can start to not just deal with the functional ecology side, but the population genetic side of these restrictions and expansions is going to be really cool.
Well, that's all the questions I had. Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
So Nalina, now that you've got that, is there anyone else there, or is it?
No, so that's all the questions we have on our end.